Alrighty, and we are live. Give me a moment. Let me make sure that that is in fact the case over on Rumble and YouTube. Hello, YouTube. Yes, we are live on YouTube. How about Rumble? What do we got here? Da, 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 da. And yes, we are live on Rumble. Outstanding. Welcome, everyone, to another reading from Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I'm Mikhail the Stray Cat. And without further ados and addendums, excuse me. In the event that you hear any background noise, I do apologize. They are cleaning the yard, so to speak, with the leaf blowers here in the apartment complex. So, if you hear that, I do apologize. Anyways, without further ados and addendums, let's get into chapter 4 and perhaps further. Chapter 4 of Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Public works mean taxes. There is no more persistent and influential faith in the world today than the faith in government spending. Everywhere government spending is presented as a panacea for all our economic ills. Is private industry partially stagnant? We can fix it all by government spending. Is there unemployment? That is obviously due to insufficient private purchasing power. The remedy is just as obvious. All that is necessary for the government to spend enough to make up the deficiency. An enormous literature is based on this fallacy. And, as so often happens with doctrines of this sort, it has become part of an intricate network of fallacies that mutually support each other. We cannot explore that whole network at this point. We shall return to other branches of it later. But we can examine here the mother fallacy that has given birth to this progeny, the main stem of the network. Everything we get outside of the free gifts of nature must in some way be paid for. The world is full of so-called economists who in turn are full of schemes for getting something for nothing. They tell us that the government can spend and spend without taxing at all. That is, can continue to pile up debt without ever paying it off because we owe it to ourselves. We shall return to such extraordinary doctrines at a later point. Here I am afraid that we shall have to be dogmatic and point out that such pleasant dreams in the past have always been shattered by national insolvency or a runaway inflation. Here we shall have to say simply that all government expenditures must eventually be paid out of the proceeds of taxation, that inflation itself is merely a form, and a particularly vicious form, of taxation. Having put aside for later consideration the network of fallacies which rest on chronic government borrowing and inflation, we shall take it for granted throughout the present chapter that either immediately or ultimately every dollar of government spending must be raised through a dollar of taxation. Once we look at the matter in this way, the supposed miracles of government spending will appear in another light. A certain amount of public spending is necessary to perform essential government functions. A certain amount of public works, of streets and roads and bridges and tunnels, of armories and navy yards, of buildings to house legislatures, police and fire departments, is necessary to supply essential public services. With such public works, necessary for their own sake, and defended on that ground alone, I am not here concerned. I am here concerned with public works considered as a means of providing employment, or of adding wealth to the community that it would not otherwise have had. A bridge is built. If it is built to meet an insistent public demand, if it solves a traffic problem or a transportation problem otherwise insoluble, if, in short, it is even more necessary to the taxpayers collectively than the things for which they would have individually spent their money had it not been taxed away from them, there can be no objection. But a bridge built primarily to provide employment is a different kind of bridge. When providing employment becomes the end, need becomes a subordinate consideration. Projects have to be invented. Instead of thinking only of where bridges must be built, the government spenders begin to ask themselves where bridges can be built. Can they think of plausible reasons why an additional bridge should connect Easton to Weston? It soon becomes absolutely essential. Those who doubt the necessities are dismissed as obstructionists and reactionaries. Two arguments are put forward for the bridge, one of which is mainly heard before it is built, the other of which is mainly heard after it has been completed. The first argument is that it will provide employment. It will provide, say, 500 jobs for a year. The implication is that these are jobs that would not otherwise have come into existence. This is what is immediately seen. But if we have trained ourselves to look beyond immediate to secondary consequences and beyond those who are directly benefited by a government project to others who are indirectly affected, a different picture begins to present itself. It is true that a particular group of bridge workers may receive more employment than otherwise, but the bridge has to be paid for out of taxes. For every dollar that is spent on the bridge, a dollar will be taken away from taxpayers. If the bridge costs $10 million, the taxpayers will lose $10 million. They will have that much taken away from them, which they would otherwise have spent on the things they needed most. Therefore, for every public job created by the bridge project, a private job has been destroyed somewhere else. We can see the men employed on the bridge. We can watch them at work. The employment argument of the government spenders becomes vivid and probably, for most people, convincing. But there are other things that we do not see because, alas, they have never been permitted to come into existence. They are the jobs destroyed by the $10 million taken from the taxpayers. All that has happened, at best, is that there has been a diversion of jobs because of the project. More bridge builders, fewer automobile workers, television technicians, clothing workers, farmers. But then we come to the second argument. The bridge exists. It is, let us suppose, a beautiful and not an ugly bridge. It has come into being through the magic of government spending. Where would it have been if the obstructionists and the reactionaries had had their way? There would have been no bridge. The country would have been just that much poorer. Here again, the government spenders have the better of the argument with all those who cannot see beyond the immediate range of their physical eyes. They can see the bridge. But if they have taught themselves to look for indirect as well as direct consequences, they can once more see in the eye of imagination the possibilities that have never been allowed to come into existence. They can see the unbuilt homes, the unmade cars and washing machines, the unmade dresses and coats, perhaps the ungrown and unsold foodstuffs. To see these uncreated things requires a kind of imagination that not many people have. We can think of these non-existent objects once, perhaps, but we cannot keep them before our minds, as we can the bridge that we pass every working day. What has happened is merely that one thing has been created instead of others. The same reasoning applies, of course, to every other form of public work. It applies just as well, for example, to the erection, with public funds, of housing for people of low incomes. All that happens is that money is taken away through taxes from families of higher income, and perhaps a little from families of even lower income, to force them to subsidize these selected families with low incomes and enable them to live in better housing for the same rent or for lower rent than previously. I do not intend to enter here into all the pros and cons of public housing. I am concerned only to point out the error in two of the arguments most frequently put forward in favor of public housing. One is the argument that it creates employment, the other that it creates wealth, which would not otherwise have been produced. Both of these arguments are false because they overlook what is lost through taxation. Taxation for public housing destroys as many jobs in other lines as it creates in housing. It also results in unbuilt private homes, in unmade washing machines and refrigerators, and in lack of innumerable other commodities and services. And none of this is answered by the sort of reply which points out, for example, that public housing does not have to be financed by a lump sum capital appropriation, but merely by annual rent subsidies. This simply means that the cost to the taxpayers is spread over many years instead of being concentrated into one. Such technicalities are irrelevant to the main point. The great psychological advantage of the public housing advocates is that men are seen at work on the houses when they are going up, and the houses are seen when they are finished. People live in them and proudly show their friends through the rooms. The jobs destroyed by the taxes for the housing are not seen, nor the goods and services that were never made. It takes a concentrated effort of thought and a new effort each time the houses and the happy people in them are seen to think of the wealth that was not created instead. It is surprising that the champions of public housing should dismiss this, if it is brought to their attention, as a world of imagination, as the objections of pure theory, while they point to the public housing that exists. As a character in Bernard Shaw's St. Joan replies when told to the theory of Pythagoras that the earth is round and revolves around the sun, quote, "What an utter fool! Couldn't he use his eyes?" Unquote. We must apply the same reasoning once more to great projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Here, because of sheer size, the danger of optical illusion is greater than ever. Here is a mighty dam, a stupendous arc of steel and concrete, greater than anything that private capital could have built. The fetish of photographers, the heaven of socialists, the most often used symbol of the miracles of public construction, ownership, and operation. Here are mighty generators and powerhouses. Here is a whole region, it is said, lifted to a higher economic level, attracting factories and industries that could not otherwise have existed. And it is all presented in the panegyrics of its partisans as a net economic gain without offsets. We need not go here into the merits of the TVA or public projects like it, but this time we need a special effort of the imagination, which few people seem able to make, to look at the debit side of the ledger. If taxes are taken from individuals and corporations and spent in one particular section of the country, why should it cause surprise? Why should it be regarded as a miracle if that section becomes comparatively richer? Other sections of the country, we should remember, are then comparatively poorer. The thing so great that private capital could not have built it has in fact been built by private capital, the capital that was expropriated in taxes, or, if the money was borrowed, that eventually must be expropriated in taxes. Again, we must make an effort of the imagination to see the private power plants, the private homes, the typewriters and television sets that were never allowed to come into existence because of the money that was taken from people all over the country to build the photogenic Norris Dam. I have deliberately chosen the most favorable examples of public spending schemes, that is, those that are most frequently and fervently urged by the government spenders and most highly regarded by the public. I have not spoken of the hundreds of boondoggling projects that are invariably embarked upon the moment the main object is to give jobs and to put people to work. For then, the usefulness of the project itself, as we have seen, inevitably becomes a subordinate consideration. Moreover, the more wasteful the work, the more costly in manpower, the better it becomes for the purpose of providing more employment. Under such circumstances, it is highly improbable that the projects thought up by the bureaucrats will provide the same net addition to wealth and welfare per dollar expended as would have been provided by the taxpayers themselves if they had been individually permitted to buy or have made what they themselves wanted, instead of being forced to surrender part of their earnings to the state. Chapter 5. Taxes discourage production. There is a still further factor which makes it improbable that the wealth created by government spending will fully compensate for the wealth destroyed by the taxes imposed to pay for that spending. It is not a simple question, as so often supposed, of taking something out of the nation's right-hand pocket to put into its left-hand pocket. The government spenders tell us, for example, that if the national income is $1,500 billion, then federal taxes of $360 billion a year would mean that only 24% of the national income is being transferred from private purposes to public purposes. This is to talk as if the country were the same sort of unit of pooled resources as a huge corporation, and as if all that were involved were a mere bookkeeping transaction. The government spenders forget that they are taking the money from A in order to pay it to B. Or rather, they know this very well, but while they dilate upon all the benefits of the process to B, and all the wonderful things he will have which he would not have had if the money had not been transferred to him, they forget the effects of the transaction on A. B is seen, A is forgotten. In our modern world, there is never the same percentage of income tax levied on everybody. The great burden of income taxes is imposed on a minor percentage of the nation's income, and these income taxes have to be supplemented by taxes of other kinds. These taxes inevitably affect the actions and incentives of those from whom they are taken. When a corporation loses 100 cents of every dollar it loses, and is permitted to keep only 52 cents of every dollar it gains, and when it cannot adequately offset its years of losses against its years of gains, its policies are affected. It does not expand its operations, or it expands only those attended with a minimum of risk. People who recognize this situation are deterred from starting new enterprises. Thus, old employers do not give more employment, or not as much more as they might have, and others decide not to become employers at all. Improved machinery and better equipped factories come into existence much more slowly than they otherwise would. The result in the long run is that consumers are prevented from getting better and cheaper products to the extent that they otherwise would, and that real wages are held down compared with what they might have been. There is a similar effect when personal incomes are taxed 50, 60, or 70%. People begin to ask themselves why they should work 6, 8, or 9 months of the entire year for the government and only 6, 4, or 3 months for themselves and their families. If they lose the whole dollar when they lose, but can keep only a fraction of it when they win, they decide that it is foolish to take risks with their capital. In addition, the capital available for risk-taking itself shrinks enormously. It is being taxed away before it can be accumulated. In brief, capital to provide new private jobs is first prevented from coming into existence, and the part that does come into existence is then discouraged from starting new enterprises. The government spenders create the very problem of unemployment that they profess to solve. A certain amount of taxes is, of course, indispensable to carry on essential government functions. Reasonable taxes for this purpose need not hurt production much. The kind of government services then supplied in return, which among other things safeguard production itself, more than compensate for this. But the larger the percentage of the national income taken by taxes, the greater the deterrent to private production and employment. When the total tax burden grows beyond a bearable size, the problem of devising taxes that will not discourage and disrupt production becomes insoluble. Chapter 7. Credit diverts production. Government encouragement to business is sometimes as much to be feared as government hostility. This supposed encouragement often takes the form of a direct grant of government credit or a guarantee of private loans. The question of government credit can often be complicated because it involves of inflation of various kinds until a later chapter. Here, for the sake of simplicity, we shall assume that the credit we are discussing is non-inflationary. Inflation, as we shall later see, while it complicates the analysis, does not at bottom change the consequences of the policies discussed. A frequent proposal of this sort in Congress is for more credit to farmers. In the eyes of most congressmen, the farmers simply cannot get enough credit. The credit supplied by private mortgage companies, insurance companies, or country banks is never adequate. Congress is always finding new gaps that are not filled by the existing lending institutions, no matter how many of these it has itself already brought into existence. The farmers may have enough long-term credit or enough short-term credit, but it turns out they have not enough intermediate credit, or the interest rate is too high, or the complaint is that private loans are made only to rich and well-established farmers. So new lending institutions and new types of farm loans are piled on top of each other by the legislature. The faith in all these policies, it will be found, springs from two acts of short-sightedness. One is to look at the matter only from the standpoint of the farmers that borrow. The other is to think only of the first half of the transaction. Now, all loans, in the eyes of honest borrowers, must eventually be repaid. All credit is debt. Proposals for an increased volume of credit, therefore, are merely another name for proposals for an increased burden of debt. They would seem considerably less inviting if they were habitually referred to by the second name instead of by the first. We need not discuss here the normal loans that are made to farmers through private sources. They consist of mortgages, of installment credits for the purchase of automobiles, refrigerators, TV sets, tractors, and other farm machinery, and of bank loans made to carry the farmer along until he is able to harvest and make his crop and get paid for it. Here, we need concern ourselves only with loans to farmers either made directly by some government bureau or guaranteed by it. These loans are of two main types. One is a loan to enable the farmer to hold his crop off the market. This is an especially harmful type, but it will be more convenient to consider it later when we come to the question of government commodity controls. The other is a loan to provide capital, often to set the farmer up in business by enabling him to buy the farm itself, or a mule or tractor, or all three. At first glance, the case for this type of loan may seem a strong one. Here is a poor family, it will be said, with no means of livelihood. It is cruel and wasteful to put them on relief. Buy a farm for them, set them up in business, make productive and self-respecting citizens of them. Let them add to the total national product and pay the loan off out of what they produce. Or, here is a farmer struggling along with primitive methods of production because he has not the capital to buy himself a tractor. Lend him the money for one, let him increase productivity, he can repay the loan out of the proceeds of his increased crops. In that way, you not only enrich him and put him on his feet, you enrich the whole community by that much added output. And the loan, concludes the argument, costs the government and the taxpayers less than nothing, because it is self-liquidating. Now, as a matter of fact, that is what happens every day under the institution of private credit. If a man wishes to buy a farm and has, let us say, only half or a third as much money as the farm costs, a neighbor or a savings bank will lend him the rest in the form of a mortgage on the farm. If he wishes to buy a tractor, the tractor company itself or a finance company will allow him to buy it for 1/3 of the purchase price, with the rest to be paid off in installments out of earnings that the tractor itself will help to provide. But there is a decisive difference between the loan supplied by private lenders and the loan supplied by a government agency. Each private lender risks his own funds. A banker, it is true, risks the funds of others that have been entrusted to him, but if money is lost, he must either make good out of his own funds or be forced out of business. When people risk their own funds, They are usually careful in their investigations to determine the adequacy of the assets pledged and the business acumen and honesty of the borrower. If the government operated by the same strict standard, there would be no good argument for its entering the field at all. Why do precisely what private agencies already do? But the government almost invariably operates by different standards. The whole argument for its entering the lending business is, in fact, that it will make loans to people who could not get them from private lenders. This is only another way of saying that the government lenders will take risks with other people's money, the taxpayers, that private lenders will not take with their own money. I'd like to take a moment and borrow from Milton Friedman for just a second. No man spends someone else's money as carefully as he spends his own. Kind of rings familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, moving on. Sometimes, in fact, apologists will freely acknowledge that the percentage of losses will be higher on these government loans than on private loans. But they contend that this will be more than offset by the added production brought into existence by the borrowers who pay back, and even by most of the borrowers who do not pay back. This argument will seem plausible only as long as we concentrate our attention on the particular borrowers whom the government supplies with funds, and overlook the people whom its plan deprives of funds. For what is really being lent is not money, which is merely the medium of exchange, but capital. I have already put the reader on notice that we shall postpone to a later point the complications introduced by an inflationary expansion of credit. What is really being lent, say, is the farm or the tractor itself. Now, the number of farms in existence is limited, and so is the production of tractors, assuming, especially, that an economic surplus of tractors is not produced simply at the expense of other things. The farm or tractor that is lent to A cannot be lent to B. The real question is, therefore, whether A or B shall get the farm. This brings us to the respective merits of A and B, and what each contributes or is capable of contributing to production. A, let us say, is the man who would get the farm if the government did not intervene. The local banker or his neighbors know him and know his record. They want to find employment for their funds. They know that he is a good farmer and an honest man who keeps his word. They consider him a good risk. He has already, perhaps, through industry, frugality, and foresight, accumulated enough cash to pay a fourth of the price of the farm. They lend him the other 3/4, and he gets the farm. There is a strange idea abroad held by all monetary cranks that credit is something a banker gives to a man. Credit, on the contrary, is something a man already has. He has it, perhaps, because he already has marketable assets of a greater cash value than the loan for which he is asking. Or he has it because his character and past record have earned it. He brings it into the bank with him. That is why the banker makes him the loan. The banker is not giving something for nothing. He feels assured of repayment. He is merely exchanging a more liquid form of asset or credit for a less liquid form. Sometimes he makes a mistake, and then it is not only the banker who suffers, but the whole community, for values which were supposed to be produced by the lender are not produced, and resources are wasted. Now it is to A, let us say, who has credit that the banker would make his loan. But the government goes into the lending business in a charitable frame of mind because, as we say, it is worried about B. B cannot get a mortgage or other loans from private lenders because he does not have credit with them. He has no savings. He has no impressive record as a good farmer. He is perhaps, at the moment, on relief. Why not, say the advocates of government credit, make him a useful and productive member of society by lending him enough for a farm and a mule or tractor and setting him up in business? Perhaps in an individual case it may work out all right, but it is obvious that in general, the people selected by these government standards will be poorer risks than the people selected by private standards. more money will be lost by loans to them. There will be a much higher percentage of failures among them. They will be less efficient. More resources will be wasted by them. Yet the recipients of government credit will get their farms and tractors at the expense of those who otherwise would have been the recipients of private credit. Because B has a farm, A will be deprived of a farm. A may be squeezed out either because interest rates have gone up as a result of the government operations, or because farm prices have been forced up as a result of them, or because there is no other farm to be had in his neighborhood. In any case, the net result of government credit has not been to increase the amount of wealth produced by the community, but to reduce it, because the available real capital, consisting of actual farms, tractors, and so forth, has been placed in the hands of the less efficient borrowers rather than in the hands of the more efficient and trustworthy. The case becomes even clearer if we turn from farming to other forms of business. The proposal is frequently made that the government ought to assume the risks that are too great for private industry. This means that bureaucrats should be permitted to take risks with the taxpayers' money that no one is willing to take with his own. Such a policy would lead to evils of many different kinds. It would lead to favoritism, to the making of loans to friends or in return for bribes. It would inevitably lead to scandals. It would lead to recriminations whenever the taxpayers' money was thrown away on enterprises that failed. It would increase the demand for socialism, for, it would properly be asked, if the government is going to bear the risks, why should it not also get the profits? What justification could there possibly be, in fact, for asking the taxpayers to take the risks while permitting private capitalists to keep the profits? This is precisely, however, as we shall later see, what we already do in the case of non-recourse government loans to farmers. But we shall pass over all these evils for the moment and concentrate on just one consequence of loans of this type. This is that they will waste capital and reduce production. They will throw the available capital into bad or at best dubious projects. They will throw it into the hands of persons who are less competent or less trustworthy than those who would otherwise have got it, for the amount of real capital at any moment, as distinguished from monetary tokens run off on a printing press, is limited. What is put into the hands of B cannot be put into the hands of A. People want to invest their own capital, but they are cautious. They want to get it back. Most lenders, therefore, investigate any proposal carefully before they risk their own money in it. They weight the prospect of profits against the chances of loss. They may sometimes make mistakes, but for several reasons, they are likely to make fewer mistakes than government lenders. In the first place, the money is either their own or has been voluntarily entrusted to them. In the case of government lending, the money is that of other people, and it has been taken from them, regardless of their personal wish, in taxes. The private money will be invested only where repayment with interest or profit is definitely expected. This is a sign that the persons to whom the money has been lent will be expected to produce things for the market that people actually want. The government money, on the other hand, is likely to be lent for some vague general purpose like creating employment. And the more inefficient the work, that is, the greater the volume of employment it requires in relation to the value of the product, the more highly lenders, moreover, are selected by a cruel market test. If they make bad mistakes, they lose their money and have no more money to lend. It is only if they have been successful in the past, that they have more money to lend in the future. Thus, private lenders, except the relatively small proportion that have got their funds through inheritance, are rigidly selected by a process of survival of the fittest. The government lenders, on the other hand, are either those who have passed civil service examinations and know how to answer hypothetical questions hypothetically, or they are those who can give the most plausible reasons for making loans and the most plausible explanations of why it wasn't their fault that the loans failed. But the net result remains. Private loans will utilize existing resources and capital far better than government loans. Government loans will waste far more capital and resources than private loans. Government loans, in short, as compared with private loans, will reduce production, not increase it. The proposal for government loans to private individuals or projects, in brief, sees B and forgets A. It sees the people into whose hands the capital is put. It forgets those who would otherwise have had it. It sees the project to which capital is granted. It forgets the projects from which capital is thereby withheld. It sees the immediate benefit to one group. It overlooks the losses to other groups and the net loss to the community as a whole. The case against government guaranteed loans and mortgages to private businesses and persons is almost as strong as, though less obvious than, the case against direct government loans and mortgages. The advocates of government guaranteed mortgages also forget that what is being lent is ultimately real capital, which is limited in supply, and that they are helping identified B at the expense of some unidentified A. Government guaranteed home mortgages, especially when a negligible down payment or no down payment whatsoever is required, inevitably mean more bad loans than otherwise. They force the general taxpayer to subsidize the bad risks and to defray the losses. They encourage people to buy houses that they cannot really afford. They tend eventually to bring about an oversupply of houses as compared with other things. They temporarily overestimate building, raise the cost of building for everybody, including the buyers of the homes with the guaranteed mortgages, and may mislead the building industry into an eventually costly overexpansion. In brief, in the long run, they do not increase overall national production, but encourage malinvestment. We remarked at the beginning of this chapter that government aid to business is sometimes as much to be feared as government hostility. This applies as much to government subsidies as to government loans. The government never lends or gives anything to business that it does not take away from business. One often hears New Dealers and other statists boast about the way government bailed business out with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and other government agencies in 1932 and later. But the government can give no financial help to business that it does not first or finally take from business. The government's funds all come from taxes. Even the much vaunted government credit rests on the assumption that its loans will ultimately be repaid out of the proceeds of taxes. When the government makes loans or subsidies to business, what it does is to tax successful private business in order to support unsuccessful private business. Under certain emergency circumstances, there may be a plausible argument for this, the merits of which we need not examine here. But in the long run, it does not sound like a paying proposition from the standpoint of the country as a whole, and experience has shown that it isn't. All right, and that will conclude this reading from Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Circumstances permitting, I will continue later on this afternoon with Chapter 7, The Curse of Machinery. Until then, as always, live free or die trying.